Welcome back to Research Unpacked from the Informed Performance Podcast. My name is Dylan Carmody, and I'm a physical therapist and strength and conditioning coach from the U.S. On today's show, we have Ola Eriksrud, and we'll be discussing all things deceleration and change of direction. Follow along as we unpack the paper, Biomechanical and Neuromuscular Performance Requirements of Horizontal Deceleration, a review with implications for random, intermittent, multidirectional sports. Ola, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've got a little bit of a time delay here, but how's your morning going?
Pretty good. Pretty good. Little slow, but I'm in Norway, Oslo, Norway. So we're getting into fall, and it's getting a little darker. So it's that time of the year with a little bit of rain. So, but it is what it is.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm sure that it's starting to slowly change, and maybe a couple indicators are starting to show up. And over here, luckily, I got stationed in Hawaii for a little bit, so I'm not seeing too many leaves falling or anything like that. It's all palm fronds and coconuts at the moment. But for any of the listeners who haven't heard about you just yet, would you mind just giving them a brief background and maybe intro to you?
Sure. Like yourself, trained as a physical therapist, UConn grad. Then I worked at UConn academically, teaching and also running a clinic before I moved back overseas to Oslo, Norway in 2005, which seems like a long time ago, but it is what it is. Work at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences. PhD is in biomechanics and motor control. Consult with the Norwegian Olympic Paralympic Committee on different projects and different athletes. I'm also in the applied domain, just to ensure you that. And then one of the founders of 1080 Motion and Athletic 1080, which is 1080 Motion is motorized resistance technology. So we've been around for the past decade now.
Combination of multiple outlets and it keeps you busy, I'm sure. But
yes.
one area that I really was sparked to kind of have you on was just your expertise in your area from a deceleration perspective and change of direction. So just in general, what really sparked that interest in yourself from a deceleration and change of direction perspective as a whole?
Yeah, and also I think it's important that we acknowledge some of the authors, the other authors of that paper in question here. Damien Harper being, a very important engine for sure in that process, and all the other authors on that. But we share a common passion, I think, and that's what's kind of led us together somehow in mysterious ways, so to speak. But I do think that it's been a large focus on the concentric phase and the acceleration of things. And if we're looking at multi-directional sports, whether that is team or individual, what is always preceding that acceleration is a deceleration. It's far less explored and it's far less studied. And it's fundamental to performance. And if we start to look into the demands of it, we see that the forces are greater, which means that we also should be very considerate in that regards. And we'll get back to some of the talking points in terms of possible links to injury and injury preventions and what have you. And if we're looking at, for instance, one lower extremity injury, non-contact ACL injury, we always look at the decel. It's on the decel side of things, and then we look at a split second or some milliseconds prior to or after that final foot contact. And I've always been very interested in that, the whole. So if I'm looking at a change of direction, I want to understand what is happening coming into that turn at a more macro level. And how does that relate to my reacceleration, whether that is in a 90-degree turn or 135 or 180 or whatever kind of turn you have. So that's where my interest comes from. So looking a little bit, taking a step back and looking a little bit more macro at it. So that's one thing. Another thing is historically we have tested and we've used overall time of change of direction tests. It does not really tell me how you do within the different phases of that movement. And when I say different phases of that movement, in a simple change of direction, you have an initial acceleration to a deceleration, then you have a turn, and then you have a reacceleration. If I do overall time, I can mask it. I can pace myself to get an okay time. But if I get information about those different two phases, I might be able to understand my athlete or patient in front of me better. And thereby, I could possibly prescribe my treatment, rehab, or training better. So that was a long-winded and a long answer, but I think all of those factors combined have contributed to it.
100%. Yeah, and I totally agree. It's this idea, like, when you're this the last point that you just made was this idea of like when you're testing change of direction as a whole, there's so many factors that are going to go into that person's ability to change direction quickly. And there's this adage that goes around, at least in the PT circles that I surround myself with, of the idea that the test tests what the test tests, right? And so if you're testing change of direction, you're going to test the entirety of that individual's ability to change direction. But if we want to look at determinants of change of direction or things like that, then we need to zoom in and we need to narrow our focus and actually test the thing that we want to test, which would be deceleration or actual change of direction timing or acceleration or things like that.
Yeah.
And I think that you put that beautifully, just in terms of like we need to get a better understanding of these determinants as a whole.
Yeah, because I've always observed, and I'm sure the listeners have observed people too that kind of pace themselves coming in. I'm like
Mm-hmm.
almost preparing myself to set up a good reacceleration. And that's been an observation for years, right? And that's even been described in the literature too. And Sophia Nymphius has done a wonderful job. Again, you have to give credit where credit is due. So in one of her papers from, I believe it's 2017 or 16, where she like goes through an awesome review of all the tests and shortcomings and what have you, she points to that it's important that we have some sort of continuous measurement during the movement to better understand this important quality. And I couldn't agree more.
Definitely. So before we dive into the paper, I kind of like asking this question just sort of as a precedent for the podcast, as well as just set expectations. But when you look back at this paper that you and this team wrote, what gap do you feel like it filled for the performance and sports community?
I think D-Cell has been put on the map, and I think there have been multiple people. I mentioned Damien, Thomas Dos Santos. I don't know. There are many more. John Kiley. There are many people there that has been involved in that process. But it's been underexplored and underappreciated because it might be difficult, right? So it's been easier for us to look at Excel. So it fills that little void, that little gap. And it's something that many people have been, like I was, alluding to earlier here, observing this. But how do I deal with it? What can I do with it? And if you look at if you do like a lit review or a search, and you're looking at Excel versus Decel, and horizontally, I might add, it's a massive difference, because you can regard a counter movement jump as a vertical change of direction, right? And that vertical change of direction, the counter movement jump, we divide it into different eccentric phases and then the concentric portion, right? Why can't we apply the same kind of thinking into the horizontal domain? And this is what we've done.
Definitely. Just your mention of the I guess maybe dichotomy between horizontal and vertical. One of your colleagues as well, Damien Harper, had published an article that kind of compared the two in terms of the like vertical, horizontal, or vertical and horizontal kind of deceleration components. Um, Do you view somebody as like if they show high marks on a vertical deceleration from whether it's a counter movement jump or a depth jump or something like that, do you view them to just inherently have better decel qualities that would transfer to the horizontal deceleration from a change of direction perspective? Or do you feel like those two factors are just kind of better attributed to the description of like just them being a better athlete as a whole?
That's a great question because and the answer is always ambiguous and it depends. But if you have a good drop jump and a good counter movement jump, you have some resources there. But uh, does that mean that you're effective, efficient in the horizontal domain? Because sometimes you observe people, and this is where actually looking at both is helpful. Because sometimes you have people and you observe them, and vertically they could be really good, solid, and you put them horizontally, and it's a completely it's a different expression of deceleration quality. Because one is the counter movement jump or the drop jump, very short. You know, it's vertical. The force is vertically oriented. If you're going to decel horizontally, you have to express forces horizontally. So obviously, technique plays a big part of that equation. So yeah, there are neuromuscular factors that feeds that will will be to some extent similar, but it's not the same between vertical and horizontal. But the technical execution over multiple steps has a different requirement, right? So, different requirement. I would like to rephrase that. It is an eccentric component to both, sure, but it is a different movement pattern. And I've done this for decades. That sounds kind of weird to say that, but we've assessed and looked at vertical force, lateral force, anterior force, posterior force. We've used motorized resistance technology for that. And then we correlate my max qualities in different directions. And sometimes for different teams in different sports, those correlations are surprisingly low, which then speaks to me that there is some sort of specificity in terms of directionality.
Yeah, I that's a very beautifully said. Just because it's difficult, we're never going to have all of the answers associated with these sorts of performance characteristics. But
No,
I think getting on track a little bit, I do think that it's also important that, like you had mentioned, both are going to require certain technical domains. Both are going to require some sort of kinetic domains and kinematic domains that may look similar, and it may or may not be just the representation that good athletes can decelerate, good athletes can accelerate, good athletes can utilize the stretch shortening cycle or whatever other sort of capacities that we're trying to test in order to leverage that to improve their own performance. But yeah, I just think it's a fun, more thought experiment, I guess, more than anything.
yeah, no, I agree.
So as your paper touched on, there are some insanely high rates of loading and peak forces that occur during maximal decelerations. Can you just give us a better understanding on, which metrics you would recommend tracking for deceleration, and how much load these athletes are actually experiencing during these tasks?
Yeah, because if you're looking at the numbers, you see that the the magnitude of the forces are far greater during the decel as compared to the reacceleration phase. And that also depends on a couple of things, obviously. But largely, it depends on your momentum coming in. Because if you're doing, say, a modified 505, you have only a 5 meter acceleration to deceleration phase, which means that the tests that we've done, they're looking at between 4 and 5 meters per second. That's the velocity that they assume before they have to slam on the brakes, right? And it's a short time frame, between 1.2, 1.5 seconds, maybe. So that is going to happen very, very quickly. And the forces are not necessarily that great. But when you're starting to increase the initial acceleration to deceleration phase, say you have a 10-meter approach and a 15-meter approach, and that's been our mechanisms for actually assessing this. We've been using motorized resistance technology with this. So we do a modified 505, we do a 1005, and then we do a 1505. And we keep the loading, the external loading, the same. So the only thing that we are manipulating is approach distance. And also, I think it's a good one because you allow the athlete to assume the velocity that they are comfortable with, which in itself tells a story. How that max velocity in that initial accel to decel phase actually manifests itself. And then you give people the freedom to select their momentum, which in turn they have to slow down. And then you see with longer tests, longer decel phases, and it's a fairly even distribution. We have an abstract submitted now to the IOC Congress in Monaco that actually talks about these things. We'll see if they accept it. That's a different story. So if you listen to this and you don't see the abstract there, that's going to be embarrassing. But that's another topic. But what kind of metric would you use? I think that's a great question, because if you look at a counter movement jump, I'm going to go back to that one. If you look at a counter movement jump on a force plate, we have a system and we can select between 180 different output variables. That's a jungle. That's a difficult place. So then we have to maneuver through that. So the place that we have started, and we've started in a very simple form, we have just taken the time. We're looking at initial accel to decel, and we're looking at time. And then we're looking at reacceleration, and we're looking at time. And then we look at total time. And then we take the ratio between those two phases. That's our starting point. Because a ratio between those two phases is actually interesting, because that shows your distribution, right? So in a modified 505, you're looking at a good performance. It's a 1.1, 1.2 ratio. And then you're looking at 1.4, 1.5. They're favoring something. They're not really willing to decelerate. So we're starting with the simplest measurement of time. And this is also where we have to think about what's easiest for the practitioners out there, because we can get lost in metrics and we can present this, Excel sheets and papers and everything, and we get data. We don't even know what to do with it. So we have started with just expressing time. Then if I'm going to go down the rabbit hole from there, I would look at, okay, what was the maximum speed you were willing to assume during that decel? Because we've seen with injuries that people are not willing to assume as great a speed. Also, I always test left versus right turn, because you might see very different behaviors left to right. So I like to have that in the mix. I give them the option. I just leave it open. Just go for that run and turn and come back here. All right. And then they self-select. So I allow them to do that 2 times. And then I do 2 times on the other leg, just to see what that looks like. And then we're using Damien's approach, where he's taking from max velocity to the turn and call that the deceleration phase, and then divided that into different phases. And then again, we're using time there right now. We're in the process of writing a whole bunch of stuff on this, and we're aggregating a massive database on it. And the purpose of that is actually to provide listeners here with some sort of reference data, with some sort of time measurements. So when they do it, they have something to lean on and say, is this a good thing or is it not so good? Because sometimes we end up with values and we don't even know what they mean. And that sounds bad coming from a scientist like myself, but, we have to be relevant to people in the field. And everything that I do, at least I try to be relevant to people in the field. So, and that's also helping myself because I work in the applied setting. So,
No,
it's a duality there. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. And because
no, I
if you're
love
going
it.
to get into if you're going to get into forces, yeah, we can take velocity data. We know the mass of the athlete. From there, we can calculate the accelerations based upon changes in velocity, and we can get into horizontal forces. So we can calculate that. That would be further down in the hierarchy, if you will. No problems doing that. But
Definitely.
we have to be cognizant of not getting caught up in too many variables that confuses us and does not allow us. So always start on the simple side, and then you can dive in. I think that would be my recommendation.
Definitely. And I think that that was great in terms of just laying things out. You had mentioned a little bit on using these timing ratios, right? In terms of, entry versus exit or accel versus decel. However, there can be occasionally limitations when we just take data from ratios. Can you maybe expand upon what limitations you may see with that?
Absolutely, because you have to know what you get, right? We always have to know what we're getting. So I can have a ratio, and let's say a modified 505 time. Let's say 2.8 to 3 seconds. Let's say that's a good one. I can have a ratio of 1.1. Oh, this is great. But the overall time is 3.6. So then that ratio becomes worthless in a sense because it has to be anchored onto the total time, the total performance. Because I can walk and change the direction and have a really good ratio, but my total time is awful. So we have to understand the limitations of doing that. And that's where total time comes in, which historically has been used. And we criticize because it doesn't reflect what's happening during the test. But we need it also as a reference to look at it, like you were saying initially here. We need that as a reference to say whether that was an overall good performance or not so good performance. So yeah, we have to understand limitations, what we get and what we're not getting.
Definitely. Can you maybe just go into a little bit? You alluded to it a little bit beforehand, but talking about this idea between even further compartmentalizing this idea from a change of direction perspective, and taking deceleration into its own components of early deceleration and late deceleration. Can you just talk about what those are, define those terms, and maybe certain qualities that might define early versus late decel?
Yeah. I wish I had like a PowerPoint to like show everyone here a graph, but I'm not going to bore you with that. Okay, so when you do a change of direction, I'll use the modified 505. Keep in mind you could also use just a sprint to a stop for the same purpose. So you can do a decel without the turn, or you can do a decel with the turn. Our data suggests that greater forces, if we compare the forces that we have observed using with turn as compared to just coming to a stop, greater forces are associated when you do a turn as to when you don't do a turn. So from a rehab progression perspective, coming to a stop induces smaller forces than coming and going into a turn. So keep that in mind. The same kind of approach can be used for both. So you start your initial acceleration. You assume what we call a maximum speed during that initial acceleration to deceleration phase. And then we say, okay, when does this happen? So we kind of mark that time point. Then you're either coming to a stop or you're doing a turn. The way that we have defined it in change of direction is when the velocity changes direction, right? So when it reaches zero and it goes in the opposite direction, because we've used a 180-degree turn here. So then you have a time interval from Vmax, and let's call when you change direction V0 or just a 0 point. V0, not to be confused with the force velocity profiling of linear sprinting. So keep that in mind for those who understood what I was talking about there. Then you have a time interval. Then you have, that's a phase. And then we define that phase as the deceleration phase. And then we have different options, actually. But currently, the option that is used is that we divide that phase further into early deceleration and late deceleration. And that is based upon your reduction in velocity. So when from your maximum velocity to a 50% reduction in velocity, let's define that as early deceleration. From that 50% reduction to 0, that's your late deceleration. So that's the current definitions. We're working on different models there. So I'm not gonna. We will come out with something. We're gonna write up some interesting things. I have a great master student, Tobias, working on some really cool stuff, and we have a meeting actually later on today about. Let's dive a little deeper into this, not to confuse the listener, but maybe help and guide, aid the listener.
I love that. When we're thinking about early versus late deceleration and kind of compartmentalizing those two,
Yep.
are there differences in maybe loads, rates of loading, or things like that that you guys have found between these two phases in deceleration? Are there like any other kinetic variables that you can use to describe these two different phases?
Yeah. If I'm doing a shorter test, say the modified 505, I have a 5 meter in, 5 meter out, greater force is late. Because you have to slam on the brakes late. That's what we're seeing. If I have a longer approach, greater force and power early. During the early. And I think that has to do with preparation. Because I can prepare better and distribute better, and I can distribute over a longer distance and a longer time. So those are some of the things. Magnitude-wise, what is very fascinating, what we've found, is that the momentum stays the same during those two phases. Almost identical. So if I divide into those two phases and I look at momentum, now we're diving into details here, everyone. My apologies. But if we're looking at momentum, the momentum stays the same for those. It's not same between tests necessarily, but within the test, it's almost, this is speculative, it's almost like it's momentum that is regulating how we actually decelerate, because they are the values that are consistent between early and late deceleration if we're using these criteria.
Wow.
So I'm sorry for the detail there. So momentum, and therefore impulse. Momentum is the product of mass and velocity. So everyone is with us.
That's amazing, and I think that it is quite interesting to understand, this idea of, what are the external variables that we aren't tracking yet, or that we're not familiar with yet, or familiar with well enough to the point where that are actually, I guess, moderating these sorts of outcomes. And I think that it is such an interesting perspective and just area to dive into. You had mentioned, go for it.
Yeah, could I add one thing there? I was at a demonstration. I was down in Gothenburg, and I got a brilliant question. What kind of data are we looking at in 10, 15 years? And I was like, I've been thinking about it. Sure. But it's rare that I get that question. So I was like, oh, that's all right. Let's go. Because what we're seeing, and obviously I use a lot of motorized resistance technology, and I use a lot of that in my research. And one of the reasons for that is that we've validated it in the lab and we've tested it for reliability. So reliability of all the data and the outcome measurements that I was just talking about will be published in open access in Frontiers shortly. So it's going to be available to all of you. Back to that question. It's what we're seeing when we're looking at velocity and how people actually express velocity over a change of direction. I think those continuous data, it's almost like a fingerprint. We're starting to see that. So I think like there are going to be, we're going to start to look at the whole, because if we start to take a step back and we think, okay, we're going to divide early and late decel based upon 50% reduction, it's a logical definition for sure. But are we actually missing something because we're applying those definitions? Or maybe we should take a step back and say, we're going to look open at this. We're going to look at the whole expression. We're going to look at the whole data series. We're going to look at all the continuous data. And then we're going to say, how is this different in a good performance versus a not so good performance? Then we can maybe, open up and see things that we might not otherwise see if we divide it into our predefined phases that we think are good. So that's almost a philosophical question, but we've seen these differences, especially for instance with an ankle sprain. We see there are big differences in the deceleration phase, and we're seeing this expression, and we're seeing this whether we're doing a modified 505, 1005, or 1505. It's a similar behavior. And if we're looking at continuous data, we are able to see it. So I think that is also another aspect of this that I wanted to throw in there. So it's a fingerprint. That's what we're starting to see.
Oh, thank you for that. No, that was great. So I just have almost a personal question here. When we're looking at these, almost, I guess we like dichotomize change direction one more time, and looking at it from a predictive versus anticipatory. Do you think that we would see a difference in this like momentum characteristic more similar to like that modified 5-meter entry point or something like that, because you don't have as much time to slam on the brakes, you just have to do it with the reactive component, or do you think that there would be some other variables that I might be missing there?
No, I think you touched on a very, very important point. Agility and change of direction are different things. Even though they're used synonymously, we have to be careful and we have to understand why and how they're different. Agility includes decision making, whereas change of direction, in my opinion, is just a physical capacity. It's a capacity to do a turn, excel, decel, and then re-excel. So when we talk about the test that we've talked about thus far, we've taken that decision making out of the equation. Now we're starting to think about how can we also include decision making into this. Because if you look at non-contact, I'm back on non-contact cruciate ligament injuries again. What are we seeing? We're seeing late decisions. Usually on the this is an example from soccer, or what we call football, rightfully so, if I might add. But we're seeing, especially in females, we're seeing that there is late decisions, and then I'm exposing myself on the deceleration side. So decision making becomes important. Nevertheless, we also need that physical quality, those neuromuscular reactive qualities, to actually be able to then deal with that, call it late/poor decision that we made. So that's one thing that we're starting to explore to see, and we have some good prospective data on this, where we've integrated this into our test battery with team handball players, with the Oslo Trauma Research Center here, to see are there differences in those individuals with ACL injuries, that are there ways that they prepare themselves prior to the turn? are there some identifiers there that we can observe and look at? So we're starting to include that into the process or pipeline or thinking, if you will. But decision making, absolutely. So if you're really good and quick decision making and have the reactive slash neuromuscular qualities in place, that would be really good. That would be really
That's
good. Again, we're dichotomizing, right? So we're putting them into buckets, but they belong together.
definitely. And it's similar to what we were talking about earlier. Some maybe these are all just the characteristics that are there with high level athletes. Maybe that's just like what creates a high level athlete, because oftentimes when you look at the elite end of sport, yes, they are the best of the best, but it also could just be a representation of, hey, like these are the people whose either decision making or like just their physical like genetics and I don't know, anthropometry and things like that, like that allowed them to hold on to like their performance for this long. They were able to avoid injury. They were able to, um, stave off those negative effects of, recovery or injury or anything along those lines. And so, I just think it's a very interesting topic to dive into.
Yeah, and I think we should go there because historically we've seen data where, let's call it elite and almost elite athletes, and we're just looking at change of direction, and they have been the same. And then we've taken agility and we've taken decision making into the mix, and then we see a difference between elite versus close to elite. Now, how did they assess that? What kind of methodologies did they actually then use to assess the change of direction in those studies? And I think we can build upon that to explore that further. Maybe we reach the same conclusion, and that's okay. But then at least we've tried to dissect it a little bit more.
Yeah.
So that is my perspective on that one, because people can attack it from that point. And so, well, there is no difference between elite and sub-elite. Sure. But what kind of tool did they use to define to measure? We have better resolution now. Okay, let's maybe revisit that question.
I love all that. We've been kind of hovering around this one topic that I kind of wanted to dive into, that the paper that you guys wrote touched on beautifully. And that's the, maybe certain considerations for the idea of the penultimate step and the antepenultimate step, and how they, differ in their abilities to, alter horizontal momentum. Could you maybe break that down for us just so that the listeners can have a better understanding of those two?
So the ultimate and the antepenultimate.
Yeah, the penultimate and the antepenultimate.
Yeah. Well, you see that, and again, I think this also has to do with, and we're seeing this in our data too, where we've tested systematically 505, 1005, and 1505. The longer the approach, the more forces that you have earlier in that decel, right? And that's what you've been seeing, and that's what was described in that paper too. However, if you have a short one, you have to turn quickly. You shift it. So, but when that paper was written, we didn't have that data to that extent available to us, or within the same study to compare. And some of these data that I'm talking about right now have not been published either. So we have to wait for that to come out. But it is a earlier distribution, so to speak, and you see that it's higher early. If that's what you're after there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it was just an interesting thought process that the paper had highlighted, just showing how the antepenultimate versus the penultimate step was just able to, if I'm reading it correctly, was able to better dissipate some of the horizontal forces associated with the change of direction. And so I think that it is interesting, because you had brought up this concept of, when we look at change of direction, we're testing capacities, because it's change of direction and they know exactly what they're doing. And so that you can they can essentially prepare for this task.
Yeah.
However, another author that you'd also mentioned, Tom DeSantos,
Yeah.
had published some work earlier in his career in terms of showing how the contribution of the penultimate step is considerably less when there's a reactive component, and just trying to discern almost, and maybe even in your opinion, do you think that when we're looking at capacities, right, the change of direction itself is a capacity, but do you feel like agility in its true definition of reaction is a capacity in and of itself, or do you feel like they're just kind of two ends of the same coin?
They're related, but they're also different. And that's like Winnie the Pooh answer. Yes, yes, both. Thank you. Because it's like, you have to have a certain capacity, right? So you can be awesome at decision making, but you can't move, right? That doesn't help you. So there is a relationship, and then the question becomes how much, right? Good enough. Good enough to do what? At what level? You know, and Thomas has done some brilliant work in that regards, and obviously some of the things that he did had the requirements of force plates, which many of us don't have. We have it here in the lab, but when I go out to work with a 15, 16 year olds playing basketball, we don't have force plates. So then we have to use, proxy measurements. And that's when the motorized resistance comes in, because at least we can get some sort of understanding of how they do it. But back to your question, they're different, but they're also related. And then the question becomes, okay, we haven't even touched upon it, but what kind of angular turn do you do? That's one thing, right? A lot of the things that I've talked about here has been a 180-degree turn. And then we have to break that down, and then we have to look at the sport, and we have to say, all right, that's great, Ola. How many 180-degree turns do we do? All right, this is the percentage of how often you do this. How about 90-degree turns? How often do you do this? All right, that's a substantially more. Okay, so the sharper the angle, the greater the angle, the more force dominant that change direction is. So if you have a 180 to 90-degree turn, we usually call that a force dominant change of direction. Between 0 and 90, we call it a velocity type change of direction, right? Because there is not that much force, required, because you're not changing the direction of your velocity that much, right? So I can maintain some of that momentum. And if you're looking at one study that I always cite, which I think is great, that's Hayter from 2015. They used radar guns, I believe, to synchronize radar guns, and they did just go sprint 135 and a 90-degree, and then you look at incrementally decreases in velocity and how that shifted. I thought it was extremely well done, to be honest with you. So that's one thing. I'm sorry if I'm veering off your question here, but yes, related, but also different. And then another thing that I would like to throw into the mix that I want the listeners to think about: what kind of locomotive pattern are you throwing into the mix? Like, am I always running? Okay, great. If I'm working with a basketball team, is that appropriate? Should I have a sprint to side shuffle? Should I have a side shuffle? Should I have some lateral movement into some sort of other movement? That's one thing. But if I'm dealing with American football, backpedaling, how do I do that? So that locomotive pattern that we throw into the mix, and if we look at some of the change of direction tests that we've used historically, sometimes they are very long and many turns and combines locomotive patterns, which is actually a good idea. So if you're doing tests, think about the locomotive patterns associated with the test that you do, or the NBA, the combine testing that they do. What kind of angular turns and what kind of locomotive patterns do we have? So that's another component that has to be considered here.
Most definitely.
Sorry,
And I
sorry, that was a little bit on a tangent here, but hopefully somewhat related.
no, Ola, I think that was great, and I think it's very helpful to appreciate those sorts of things because I think uh, like you were saying, in terms of the accessibility, there's commonly, if you're a clinician, if you're a coach, if you're a scientist, you don't always have access to the greatest amounts of technology or things like that. And so
You
I
don't.
do think that it's easy for some individuals to just say, well, let's do a running 180-degree change of direction because based on the data that we have, that's probably going to be, if we have a long entry like distance, it's probably going to be the most amount of load that we're going to put through somebody. And so if they can handle that, then great, they can probably handle other things. However, I think that disregards some of the kind of like you've been mentioning locomotive patterns or the kinematics or the way in which the body orients itself associated with the very different types of change of direction depending on the sport that somebody's participating in.
Yeah,
And I just
yeah, because we've created a little model for that. Like, okay, what kind of locomotive pattern do you put into the initial exhale to deceleration phase? What kind of angular turn do you do? What kind of locomotive pattern do you do, and in what direction after the time? So we try to like break that down. Does that mean that you have to assess and address all of them, all of the possible options in a test session? Absolutely not. But I think the awareness of them and understanding the limitations of what you do is very important. And maybe then down the road, we can actually say, well, if you're in basketball, you might want to consider this one because that one seems to be related. And this is also where talking with people from other disciplines, and if you're working in a pro sport or a collegiate sport environment, discussing with the strength coaches, with the athletic trainers, the physios, the assistant coaches, and the head coaches, what is it that they are saying? What is it that they are seeing? Because those conversations can be extremely valuable. And I remember some of the conversations that I've been having where the head coach would be saying like, okay, if I put him on I'm talking about soccer here. If I put him on a right wing and he cuts left, he's great. But if I put him on his left wing, he's awful cutting to his right. Okay, what can we address in that regards? How can we think about that? So these are considerations that we have to throw into the mix here. I'm not trying to complicate things. I'm just trying to be honest.
definitely. And Ola, I think maybe I would say putting you on the spot a little bit. Let's say you have a similar interaction, whether you're a consultant or whether you're working directly with a team, and they bring up whether it's GPS, accelerometer data, something along those lines that shows that an individual consistently is cutting left every time or cutting left 90% of the time. Where does your mind go in terms of maybe reasons why that's the case, kind of like you had said from the position specific determinants, but or whether or not like you would actually try to consult with that player to fix what they're doing, or if that's just a manifestation of the game that they're playing and the style of play that they do.
Ooh, that's a tough one. How should I start with this one? Maybe it is their strength and their that's theirs. It's not a secret weapon, but it is their weapon. It's their sharp sword. That's what they're using. That's what they're leaning on. That's what they're successful with. If we're fixing the other one, are they going to use that? I'm going to use one example that blew my mind. It's anecdotal, but this was Bayern Munich. This was a Champions League game. I always go to warm-ups because I like to watch the warm-ups because I think they're fascinating. Arjen Robben, Dutch player. For those of you who know, he's a right wing. He actually he will go down the right wing and cut to the middle of the pitch, so cut to his left. He did not work with the rest of the team during a general warm-up. what he did in warm up, he went down the right wing and he cut to the left. During the game, he scored 2 goals doing that. So we have to be cognizant of what is the secret sauce, what's the winning ingredient. It could be that is the most lethal weapon that athlete has. That said, if you see that someone is always positioning themselves away from one side because they don't feel like they can turn or be as effective, now I'm on the defensive end of the ball here. I'm using ball sports as an example. To favor something, to camouflage something, then I would probably address it. And also, if the head coach is saying that he's always getting beat to the outside or something, right? Okay. Are there physical things that we could address in that context that allows them to do that better? Looking at technique, looking at neuromuscular factors, reactive factors. Are there things there that we could address? So that is a very, very, very difficult question, in my opinion, and it's very context dependent. So
Definitely.
I think I'm Winnie the Pooh. It's like, yes, thank you both. So it depends when it comes to that, but I would definitely look and go into how they do things. One assessment of a basketball player, we did that, and then we found lateral explosion coming off the left was not so good. So we saw that he favored that on the defensive side of the ball because he was afraid to be beat. So then we could get into a conversation. We saw he knew subconsciously, consciously. And then we started to address that issue. So that would be how I would, approach it. And then the head coach was there, which
Always helps.
ended up with some really good discussions of ownership from the head coach, ownership within the player. Then if you own that process and you own that understanding, that's one of the most important things that we do at the Norwegian Olympic when we work with athletes. Athletes own their process, they own their training. That's what we're trying to facilitate massively. Ownership. That's like one of the biggest common denominators up there, I think. Why I say up there, it's right down the street.
Yeah, it's not only that is, but it's the communication with other stakeholders, like you've been mentioning too. It's yourself, it's other coaches, it's other performance people, it's physical therapists, whoever it is that are all kind of having their hands in the bucket, so to speak. Everybody's all on the same page and everyone's communicating, because not everyone's going to be able to be the best in a certain situation, which is why you can lean on a team.
No, absolutely. And if you end up with those conversations and the head coach see that you're really thinking about what's meaningful on that pitch, you're trying to address it. And then if you're able to change that as a function of time, you have a good friend. That's for sure. You have a really good friend.
Ola, I want to be cognizant of your time and make sure that we don't take you for too long. But wrapping things up a little bit here, what areas, talking about this paper, what areas would you still like to just maybe give the listeners a brief little bit of information about, or a cue for them to read, or just a little maybe synopsis about what this paper talks about and those sorts of things?
It talks about the requirements for horizontal deceleration or deceleration. That's what it talks about. The vantage point is to target horizontal. It's a very, very dense paper. It has tons of references, tables, with a high level of detail. So it's not like a paper, I'm just going to read this through and then I'm going to... It's one of those papers that requires you to reread it and think about it, and then reread it again and think about it. So I think this framework has set the stage for what's to come, right? Because now that we are increasing the awareness of that horizontal component, the obvious question is, what do we do about it? That's the obvious question that this paper leads to, which is obviously then the next paper that we're working on. How do you address this? How can you address this? So that's the next level here. So we're just trying to pinpoint a little bit of a gap or somewhat understudied area that we feel is very, very important to many things, and raise that awareness. I think that's what we're trying to do here. But it's dense. It's very, very dense.
Well, I will certainly be some of the first in line when that next paper comes out. Although,
It
thank you
has
so much.
we're working on it, and it has been submitted somewhere. I cannot say where. So it will see. You will see. It will be published. Hopefully, it depends on the review process. And for those of you who have been in a review process, you know it's a game. So we'll see what happens on that end. But I think that paper is really good, in my own humble, biased opinion. And again, Damien has been the engine behind that paper as well. So, which has led to, we are also looking at intervention studies. How do we target horizontally? So we're designing different intervention studies right now. So it's leading into that. It's leading into, this is wonderful, this paper, this is wonderful, this is great, but what do I do about it? And how can I do something about it? So that's what we're trying to address there. So it's kind of like part one of a two-part series, if you will.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to part two
So
when it comes out.
So that was a little bit of an advertisement for that paper.
I love it. All right. Well, one thing that I like to ask all of our guests towards the end of the podcast
Sure.
is, just understanding and knowing that our, listeners are generally people in sports science, sports rehab, some type of strength and conditioning, all within like this kind of elite sport sector. And, we're trying to bring on researchers in different areas like that. Who would you recommend we bring on next for the show?
Damien would be a good guest. Maybe wait a little bit because we've talked a little bit about it, but Damien is great. Thomas dos Santos. If you want to look at the acceleration side of things, Ken Clark, JB Moran, obviously. I haven't gone through your entire list of contributors prior to, so I don't know if they have been on or not. But they're really, really good people, really knowledgeable. James Wild, he would be excellent. He has some real interesting things, some change of direction and agility. Brilliant guy. So those are a few, and now I'm talking within this kind of sphere and domain, if you will. But they're excellent people.
Great. Yeah, that is a powerhouse list of people. So we'll be sure to do our best to get as many of them on and go from there.
They if they have time, they'll say yes. That's not a
Totally.
problem. But it's part of, actually, if you think about it, part of our job in academia is actually being out there sharing knowledge, right? That is part of our job description, and this is one platform of doing it. Publications is one thing. This is another platform, sharing knowledge. So we should be available to these things.
I like that. Yeah, it's all about information dissemination, and whatever vehicle you choose to use it is up to you. But Ola, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it, and I think our listeners will as well. For anybody who may want to get in touch with you or just reach out, what would be the best way and format to do that?
It's probably, well, you could look at Twitter, Ola Athletic 1080. Email is probably the best. I don't know if you can put that in the notes, but it is Ola E at nih.no. So that's my email address. I'm a little bit on social LinkedIn too. Look me up on LinkedIn and message me on LinkedIn too. Could be a very helpful place. But those three, you should be able to get a hold of me. And if I don't answer right away, don't take it personally.
Right on. Well, Ola, thank you so much for being on the podcast,
No,
and
thank
we
you.
really appreciate it. Have a good evening
No, all
or
right, you
morning.
too. Yeah, thank you. You too.